Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, How Major Donors Support a Growing Nonprofit News Industry. My name is Emily Roseman. I am INN's Research Director. I am joined today by my co-presenter, Lisa Gardner-Springer. Lisa, I'll let you say hello.
Hello. So I just joined INN in mid-September as Chief Development Officer. So I'm thrilled to be here and talk about fundraising with all you other fundraisers. So it looks exciting.
Yeah, and we just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, especially on a Friday afternoon during what feels like a particularly busy week in the nonprofit space. So thank you for joining us. All right, let's get started. So a quick agenda. I'm going to kick us off by quickly describing INN for those of you who are unfamiliar and what the nonprofit news field looks like. I'll be sharing a few major donor dollar trends across the nonprofit news field. And not only will I share top level trends, but I'm going to get into the weeds on what that data looks like according to geographic scope of outlet. So I'm talking about local news versus state news versus national and global news. We have some great advice for you major donor development professionals out there in the room, brought to you by Lisa here on our team. And then just like any good major donor development thinkers and team members here, we have a few pitches for you. So please hang on so we can get to our pitches for you, our audience. And in the end, we should have a good chunk of time for some questions. We're going to take like a halfway break for any questions that you might have on the first few slides. Please feel free to drop any of your questions into the chat box as we're going. And we have a few people here who will just be tracking those questions and making sure we get to all of them. We will have some time for questions. We might end a bit early, so let's see what happens, but we could be able to give you back some of your Friday afternoon here as well. All right. For those of you who are unfamiliar, INN is a news network that supports over 300 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news organizations. And a big part of our work is generating research and knowledge about the field of nonprofit news. This is a rapidly growing field, so we're still really discovering and uncovering development best practices. A major part of our work is also towards discovering what works best for major donor development for nonprofit news and turning that knowledge into services, trainings, labs for our members to really help them identify and build their own relationships with the major donor network. The cornerstone for INN's knowledge about major donors across the field comes from our annual INN Index study. And this is really the most comprehensive study of nonprofit news. It is an annual study that we conduct each year across all of our members. This past year, we saw 94% participation from our members. So the data you're going to hear about today is very representative of the nonprofit news field. We published our full annual report back in June, where we really documented the incredible growth across the field, growth in terms of number of outlets and also revenue. And just past 2 months ago in September, we published a supplemental report, which is in chat. You should check it out later. That reviews the different types of nonprofit news. And that's where we break down our data into local news versus state. We also have fact sheets on single topic outlets and outlets that primarily serve communities of color. So yeah, check that out after this. So I want to just, before we dig into the major donor data, give you a sense of what I mean when I say nonprofit news, because nonprofit news is really kind of an umbrella term that we use to describe different types of revenue models and different types of news outlets. In our most recent index survey, we found that about a third of nonprofit news in our membership are global or national outlets. These are the really big, often older outlets like, ProPublica and others that have been the strongholds of the field for so long. A third of our members are state or regional outlets. I like to think of these as somewhere kind of in between national and globals, and then between the locals. Over a third of our members are local outlets, and this is actually our fastest growing sector of the nonprofit news field. And so we expect to see that 36% of our membership to really be steadily growing in the next several years. This matters, keep this in mind, because when I'm talking about major donor trends, I'm going to talk about those trends in terms of these different types of outlets. So this is a helpful cheat sheet to have. Quick definition check too. When I talk about major donor contributions, it seems like people sometimes define that in different ways. Here at INN, when we say major donor, we mean contributions of $5,000 or more. Mid-level donors, you'll hear me use that term. That means to us, gifts between $1,000 and $5,000. And then small dollar contributions are gifts of less than $1,000. Okay, so here is my first interactive question for all of you. And I want each of you to really take a guess at this answer and post it into chat. So how much money do you think went to nonprofit news from major donors in 2020? This is the total dollars contributed by over 2,000 major donors to nonprofit news last year. I want you to take a minute and just take your best guess and put it into chat, and we'll see what we get. Okay, we got a good guess. We got some 10 million. Awesome. 15 million, 2 million. And this is total, this is all major donor. Ooh, 675. Wow, 20 million. Yeah, this is like Price is Right. Oh, that would be a fun session of Price is Right with our index data. Thank you. All right, so we got a range of responses here. I have you on the edge of your seats. The answer is $70 million. Let's see who got closest. We got a bunch of 50s. So I think the people who said 50 might have won. Paige, I think you're our winner. $70 million came from major donors last year and went into the nonprofit news field. This is a lot of money. I think we can grow this number in the years ahead, because as you'll see in a moment, the number of major donors per outlet and per sector varies pretty largely. And so keep this number in the back of your head in the next few slides. $70 million. Major donor dollars are so important and so important to nonprofit news because they make up the backbone of individual giving to nonprofit news. On your left is a revenue pie of total revenue to nonprofit news in 2020. You can see that foundations make up about half of total revenue to nonprofit news. This is a mix of national, local, community foundations. Over a third comes from individual giving, including these major donor dollars. And a smaller slice of earned revenue comes in about 14%. This has kind of stayed the same year to year at the nonprofit news field. Let's take a closer look, though, at this individual giving segment here. When you zero in on just that 36%, you can see how important major donor dollars really are to nonprofit news. Major donors are contributing over 60% of total individual giving dollars to the nonprofit news field. A lot of focus has been going into building out small dollar donor programs, membership programs. There's been a lot of progress there, and we're seeing that slice of the pie steadily grow year over year, which is very exciting. But it's just really important, and why we're here today is because major donors really are the current backbone of individual giving contributions to nonprofit news. A few just quick trends to review with you. So thanks to some incredible data from our members, we're able to start seeing year over year trends like this. And so from 2019 to 2020, in this crisis year, we saw 6 out of 10 of our outlets that had comparable data grew overall revenue from major donors. So we do think this is a growing sector of revenue for the field. The average number of major donors per outlet also grew from 8 donors in 2019 to 10 major donors in 2020. This contributed to the next trend that I'm about to show you, which is a decrease in the average contribution per major donor. We saw the average contribution about $47,000 in 2019. This did dip to about $30,000 in 2020. And our read of this is because total revenue from major donors did increase and there were more major donors in 2020, our interpretation is that this average contribution was due to the influx of new first-time major donors that came in with smaller amounts than perhaps recurring or older major donors. So we're going to keep an eye on that trend in future years of index data. We're super curious to hear from all of you and to hear from our members about whether you're noticing any major donor trends in this current year. So I just shared a lot of facts and figures about the total kind of nonprofit news field, really talking about the field in this umbrella term. But remember back to the beginning of this presentation when I showed you that slide that broke out the field in terms of local outlets, state outlets, national and global outlets. We're going to use that framework in these next few slides to look really closely to see where this major donor revenue is coming from and where it's going. And my big thesis here is that the geographic scope of nonprofit news outlets really affects and dictates major donor dollars. So a closer look. Here I'm going to show you what the individual giving pie looks like by these 3 different types of outlets. So remember that pie I showed you with the 62% coming from major donors from individual giving. We're going to kind of dupe that out by these 3 different types of outlets. So among our local news members, which make up over a third of nonprofit news, we see about 40% of their individual giving revenue coming from major donors, and then 30-ish% from small dollar donors. Compare this to their state and regional news counterparts, where you see over half of individual giving dollars coming from major donors. They also have a very steady flow of funds coming from small dollar donors and members. And we often talk about our state and regional outlets as able to build out really sustainable and diverse streams of income. You can see how that's reflected here just in their individual giving pie, which is pretty spread out here. And then finally, national and global outlets, 70% of their individual giving revenue is coming from major donor dollars. Not so much revenue is coming from small dollar donors or members. And Kate, I see your question. It's a good one. I'll just pause to explain that. So in our index survey, some of our members, some of INN's member outlets have membership programs where they, are building unique relationships with their readers, and they call it a membership program. And so if that's the case, we ask them to count it under membership, the membership kind of slice of the pie here. Those are also all contributions under $1,000. And so if it's easier, you can kind of almost combine the small dollar slice with the member slice. It's the same amounts, but we like to separate it just because we do see growths in membership programs that are different from just small dollar programs, and we want to make sure that's reflected in these charts. So I'll just pause here and just really try to get a sense of how different these different revenue pies are. The thesis here again is that the lion's share of major donor dollars is really going to these larger, older national and global nonprofit news outlets. And I'm going to get into the real numbers here, which is what a lot of people usually like to see. So in 2020, there were 470 major donors that gave to a local nonprofit newsroom. And between those 470 major donors, they contributed $5 million to a local news combined. We can compare this to the state and regional counterparts who had over 600 major donors, collectively contributing $16 million to the state and regional outlets across the field. And then finally, for our national and global outlets, close to 1,000 major donors collectively contributed close to $50 million to the nonprofit news field, specifically to national and global outlets. So I like to bring people's attention to this slide because there's so many different nuggets of information and strategy that you can get out of this. One is that if you're here representing a local news outlet, we hear from our members that it's pretty validating to kind of see that 5 million figure. If you're struggling to really find and identify a major donor to contribute to your newsroom, it's not quite as developed as the major donor spaces for our national and global outlets. And if you're a local news outlet, you're probably more likely to see contributions from major donors in the $10,000, $15,000 space. Of course, do your prospect research ahead of time on each of these potential donors. But that matters because it's different than the scale of contributions that we're talking about when we look at our national and global outlets, who really are likely seeing contributions more in the 50,000, 60,000, even up to the hundreds of thousands of dollars per major donor. So this kind of gives you a quick kind of benchmarking snapshot at where major donor pitches should be by type of news outlet. The second thing I want to bring your attention to is that mid-level donor rung. So I didn't review that in detail, but I think it's important to include that level so you get a sense of the pipeline for each of these types of outlets. So I'm really excited by the 2,000 mid-level donors in the local news box on the left, because my hunch is that that group of 2,000 mid-level donors can be kind of built relationships with and turned into major donors in the years ahead. Another thing I'm excited about is, honestly, like 400 does not seem like that many people to me. I'm probably wrong, but I think there's so much potential in this field. This is such a young field in terms of being a nonprofit that there is so much room for growth. I think we can really kind of raise these numbers exponentially in the years ahead. I'm going to share this slide and then I'm going to pause and see if you have any questions on all of the data and figures and numbers that I've been throwing at you. So please feel free to put any of your questions so far into the chat box, and I'll try to get to a few before I pass the mic to Lisa. This slide I'm including because thinking about how most of major donor dollars are going to those national and global outlets. This is a heat map where we mapped out where those contributions are going across the country. My conclusion here is that the majority of major donor dollars are going to Northern California, Chicago, DC, and New York City. INN's goal and our mission here is to turn this whole map bright red. We think this map should be representative of, the population, and that major donor dollars should be spread across the country according to need. And so this is also a map that we'll be kind of closely tracking in the years ahead. I'm going to pause here on this slide and answer Jan's question, which are also major metro contributions, not local and rural areas, right? Yes, that's right. So this map is of all major donor dollars, not just national and global. But I share it because I think it's interesting to see where those dollars are mostly getting invested as of 2020. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause. I know I just threw a lot at you. Does anyone have any questions for me on any of the data I just shared? And I'll just go back to this slide, which is perhaps the most numbers heavy of the bunch. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them into chat or even comments, observations. If not, we will keep going, and then we'll have another opportunity at the end to also ask questions as well. Okay. All right, folks, I think we're going to keep getting, I can sense you are excited for the practical tips. What does this mean in practice? So I'm gonna,
Oh, wait.
a few questions. Okay. How are we as industry benchmarking related to the rest of the nonprofit sector? Does change in donor type affect maturation of the industry? Ooh, that's a really interesting question. So Lisa, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, but compared to the nonprofit sector at large, we see similar giving trends to news compared to other types of nonprofits. And that really came to light last year during the COVID crisis, where the news industry followed a similar kind of pattern of growth with other kind of nonprofits. The field is younger, though, than other types of nonprofit news fields. So this is really a pretty experimental space in the scheme of things.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. It's like you can look at like, you know, I'm sure you're going to see some similar patterns in terms of like the bigger, like if you look at like social service organizations, for instance, the bigger national groups are going to draw a lot of the significant money. Local ones, maybe not as much, except, you know, with like certain exceptions, you know, like I know here, like I live in Minneapolis, and I know like right after George Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of local donations that came into local organizations. But I mean, those tend to be exceptions rather than the rule. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this is a young industry, as Emily points out, and but I think that we are kind of seeing some of these trends that are kind of happening a bit. Yes, and I did see that note from Michael about national outlets. So yes, Mother Jones is one, ProPublica is one, ICIJ is one, they're here too. But yeah, The Guardian, they're not a member, so they're not included in this study, but I'm aware that they have a rather sizable endowment. So there is that too, which is all kind of part of it. Okay.
All right, I will officially pass you the mic, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, so we're now on to like, what are the opportunities for generating major donor revenue in 2022? And honestly, I'm just going to go through some best practices as well. That's all part and parcel with this at this point. Okay, so next slide, there we go. Okay, so some general strategic recommendations for our nonprofit news outlets. If you're a startup or you're just new to major giving, we just basically recommend creating a compelling case for support. And I will get into some more details on that in a minute. If you're a local or a state outlet and you've got a case and a base of your donors, it may be time to look a little bit more at conversion and moves management. That is, how do you turn those small dollar contributors into mid-range donors, and then your mid-range donors to major donors. And then finally, if you are a national or a global outlet in the room, you probably have a good base. You've got a good major donor base, and it may be time to think about planned giving, which is an exciting new opportunity for you. Okay, so next slide. On building a case for support. Well, this is what is a case for support, first of all. It is a straightforward document that tells your prospective donors what your organization hopes to accomplish with their philanthropic gifts. What does it do? It explains the history of your organization. It demonstrates proof of your organization's impact, and it inspires a prospective donor to make a gift. So that's the key. But then What goes into a case for support? Well, here's a little recipe card for you. And this was sort of the best font I could find that could look like handwritten, something on an index card. In a case for support, the key ingredients are you have an emotional opening, because really, I think this is something that often gets overlooked. News people can get really into data, but remember, like, your best stories are often the ones that have that emotional hook. So that hook can really make a big difference. It talks about your mission and your vision. You fold in your organization's history. You put in your program description, the outcomes and your general impact, and you put in your financial need. And at the end, it will hopefully yield one good, compelling story of why they should be giving to your organization. Okay. All right. So I'm actually now going to turn it back to Emily, because she did this really amazing case study of Bay City News and how they raised major donor revenue in a time of hardship. So I'm going to turn it back over to Emily real quick.
Thanks, Lisa. The point I want to make here, and thank you, Sumia, who just dropped the link to this case study in the chat. So I'd recommend checking out this case study, which really goes deep on how Bay City News, one of our really superstar members at Major Donor Development, increased major donor contributions during just a crisis year. The point I want to make here is that, and something that the case study really highlights, is Kat Rowlands, who is the founder and the leader of this organization. One of the big things she did is she knew that their project priorities were rapidly changing during the COVID crisis. They wanted to produce different kinds of coverage. They knew they needed to pivot. And so not only did the news organization have to make that change, but her fundraising strategies had to change. They had to adapt. And so in 2020, she kind of got with other folks in the news organization, and they brainstormed their big priorities in 2020 and came up with a new case for support, which you can see here. And that is also in the case study if you want a clearer image of this. But you can see, yeah, she clearly says, like, our three big priorities are the COVID hub, the Equity Ripples project, and an Earth Matters project. And she was able to kind of quickly turn around this updated case for support and start shopping it around to her major donors. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, so now the second recommendation, again, conversion or moves management. So we looked at 20,000 small dollar donations, and INN found that 40% of those donors analyzed could give substantially more. So the capacity is there. And so it just, when you are at a point when you have this base and you've got a case, it's time to really think about looking a little more deeply into your donor base and see how can you take your smaller donor folks, turn them into mid-range into major donors. So, and INN has some resources for that, but I'll get to that in a little bit later. On to the next slide. And then finally, planned giving and nonprofit news. Here's another little statistic. 8%, all of 8% of nonprofit news organizations reported securing planned giving commitments in 2020. Now, we are a young field, so this is somewhat new to us. And asking people about their planned giving options is not exactly the most comfortable thing to do. It can be awkward, but let's emphasize this a little bit. Other nonprofits ask their major donors about this all the time. For instance, development staff at universities and hospitals. They will probably give, they might give to you, and they may give to their university, and they may have their university or other groups in their planned giving commitments. So how does one go about doing this? How does one ask these kinds of questions? Well, here are some basic prompts about that you can maybe think about with asking your major donors about their legacy. How many charities other than us do you support? Have you already made a charitable gift in your will? Have you thought about some of these options? Have you thought about making a gift in your will? That sort of thing. The other thing that you can think about with your major donors as well, particularly those who are aging, and this is not something that's in this slide, is there are required minimum distributions from IRAs. You can contribute those to organizations as well. That's another potential revenue source. Okay. On to the next slide. So where to start? Okay. Again, these are a little bit fundamentals and 101s of just doing major donor prospecting, cultivating, et cetera. But first off, do your research, really understand who it is you're asking of them, what are their interests, try to kind of figure out, what makes them tick. Secondly, as you're doing your cultivation process, be courteous, be patient, and you need to be persistent. Don't nag, but you do need to be a little more persistent on things. And then when they give, I put this in all caps, please thank them promptly, personally, make sure that there's something that's coming from your CEO, make sure that it's something that's directly connected. And then finally, speaking of connections, keep all of your mid-range and your major donors connected to your work. In fact, keep all of your donors connected to your work. It's just you may want to put a little more of a personal spin on, those who give a little bit more at times. It depends on how how you want to kind of run your operation. Okay, our pitch to you. First off, are you a nonprofit newsroom but are not yet an INN member? Well, we'd encourage you to look at our website and consider joining us. We have services that are specifically around cultivating, identifying, building up a major gift pipeline. And these include our Network Philanthropy Center. We offer wealth screening to our members. We have cohorts that go through a weeks-long process around how to develop major gifts. We offer office hours to get some more one-on-one advice. We also offer resources for startups and for emerging leaders, and as well for newsrooms that might be considering moving from for-profit to nonprofit. So there is that. And also, are you interested in building the capacity of nonprofit news? I'm just saying this because we are going to be hiring soon. The jobs are not posted yet, but please consider following us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter Innovation. So there'll be a couple of positions that will be coming up in the near future. And then there's Newsmatch. It's Newsmatch season. So what is Newsmatch? It's our annual year-end matching fundraising campaign, which is done in partnership with the Miami Foundation and News Revenue Hub. Over the past 5 years, it has generated tens of millions of dollars from individual donors and from local matching funds. And that's actually a trend we're seeing a little bit more now, and it benefits hundreds of INN members. And we can be major donors too. Head to findyournews.org. That is a place where if you're not sure where to give and you want to kind of look at different local outlets, state outlets, others, national outlets. We've got a really nice website that our Newsmatch program manager, now Chief of Program Growth, Courtney Hurt, has developed. All right. And so this comes to the end of our presentation. Thank you all for hanging out with us, and we're happy to field any questions. We've got our emails here, we've got some links. Gonna kind of end my talking now. Happy to see if there's anything in the chat, or if you guys want to just pipe in somehow, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lisa. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. If you don't have any questions and you want that precious 20 minutes back in your Friday afternoon before the next LendFest program, feel free to jump. Otherwise, you can stick around and we'll hang out for the next several minutes to chat with you all. I have a question here from Matt. Are your members finding more success with a general case for support, e.g., these are our priorities, or specific cases for support for individual priorities? Help us fund an arts reporter. That's a really great question.
And I will say I'm going to kind of play my little newbie card here and say I don't know yet, but but that is a really wonderful thing that we can look into. And I don't know, Emily, this could be something we could maybe explore as a case study, perhaps, of looking at what has been successful or not. So.
Yeah, and I will say, just in my anecdotal like chats with our members, I do think the specific cases for support are what major donors tend to like to see, especially if you're matching those pitches to their interests. The Bay City News case really gets into this because her pitches were quite specific. She had 3 projects in mind that were very topical that she knew some of her major donors would be interested in, and that's what worked for her. Matt, I'm curious too, if you can feel free to unmute and share your own experiences there as well.
Oh, I think it's just something that we're trying to figure out as, coming from the public radio model. We have a really strong base, but as we start to talk about 5, 6, 7-figure gifts, we think, all right, is it just that you love us in general operating, or do we need to match your specific passion and interest? And I don't think I've found a trend. Both seem to work, but I'd love to know if there's a greater trend out there.
Yeah, I mean, and Matt, just so you're aware, I also came from like the public media world, and and I know that the general view was like, for individual donors, you try to steer as much to unrestricted support as possible, which tends to make your case a little, it's like you try to sort of like talk about some of the specific aims that you're trying to do, but not necessarily like pull it into like, you are only going to be funding this thing, but to try to kind of make it a bit more general. And like I said, I'm still kind of learning a little bit on what's going on in the nonprofit news space. But I think that's always kind of that trick of just like, do you want to pull major donors into restricted support? And that gets, like I said, it gets a little bit dicey at times. So I don't know, your finance team might have words essentially. So.
I also want to welcome anyone in this Zoom to unmute themselves and ask a question, or also if you are noticing anything interesting in your major donor work this past year, anything that's perplexing to you. This seems like a pretty robust group of major donor thinkers and business leaders. So feel free to use this Zoom and this time now for your benefit. Any final thoughts, questions, concerns, plans for 2022?
I was about to type this, but I'll just ask. This is Michael from my news source.
Oh, hey, Michael.
I'm just wondering. And I'll say I'm fairly new to the nonprofit news fundraising arena, specifically, but I wanted to ask, and I know this is that kind of cruel thing to do to ask you about the thing you didn't present on, but if we're looking at, this is something that I'm thinking of quite a bit, growing the base of smaller donors. I'm just wondering if you had any insights on that and how that looks. I wonder, are we right now in nonprofit news necessarily, but maybe at our own peril, leaning too heavily on the top tier, the top of the pyramid, and what are things looking like towards the bottom of the donor pyramid and those lower gifts, which I always hesitate to call low gifts. It always feels bad.
They still matter. Yeah, that's a great question. Our index report has a lot on this, Michael, if you want to check that out. That's all under our research tab on INN's website. I will share that we saw small dollar donor contributions were the type of financial contribution that grew most last year. So in a year of crisis, it was really those small dollar donors who stepped up. A lot of first-time small dollar contributors entered the nonprofit news mix last year. So definitely a field that we should not, overlook, because there are many types of news outlets that are finding that they can become a really substantial piece of the revenue pie. In 2020, I have right here, there were over 270,000 small dollar donors across the whole field. Their average contribution was $91. And in total, all small dollar donors combined, it was $25 million. Compare that against the 70 million. So it's definitely an important piece of the field. And I would just throw in to your question, we find email newsletter cultivation as one of the most successful things for our members with niche audiences to really find, engage, and cultivate their readers into small dollar contributors.
Right.
And Newsmatch actually does a lot around that. Newsmatch is a major incentive that many of our members use to push those loyal readers into email subscriber and into a first-time small dollar contributor with that match incentive.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Greater Public and CPV might be great partners. Yes, yeah, we love Greater Public and we've worked with them in the past. Matt, I might reach out to you because we have struggled with lining up the line items of revenue data for digital first outlets and public media because the accounting systems are so distinct. And so to be honest, we include the public media data in a lot of our top level projections, and but it has been a struggle for us to kind of weave it into some of the benchmarking data you saw today. But that's a great piece of advice. All right, well, thank you all for joining us. And we have our email addresses up on the screen. I'm at emily.r@inn.org and Lisa is at lisa@inn. So send us a note, say hello, send us your questions. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yep. Thank you all.